everyone, and welcome to the Intralingo World Lit podcast. I'm Lisa Carter, founder and creative director of Intralingo, offering wholehearted explorations of life through stories. Today, I'm so pleased to present a conversation that I had with two members of Wayfarers Book Club, as well as the translator Curtis Bauer, who translated the novel Home Reading Service by Fabio Morábito, published by Other Press. It was a wide-ranging conversation, as these things always are. We talked about the social commentary in this novel from Mexico, Fabio's predilection for oddities and irony, humor in his work, and of course, poetry. Both Fabio and Curtis are poets, and this particular novel revolves around a poem. We talk a lot about the transformational power of poetry and prose, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for listening. Good. Well, thanks again so much for being here.
My pleasure.
It's really, really special. So I have so many questions, so I'll just start with a few, and then of course Heidi and Kathy are going to jump in, and anyone else who's able to join us. But I think probably the first one I want to talk to you about in particular, Curtis, is this whole notion of poetry. So Fabio is a poet, you are a poet. The novel revolves around a poem by Isabel Freire.
Yeah.
And, you know, what is it that you think that you particularly as a poet, as a translator, brought to the novel in the translation? And how did poetry just sort of weave into all of this for you beyond the obvious?
Yeah, fantastic question. But a really difficult one, I suppose, to answer. To think of, I guess the big part of it is just the fact that I gave more attention to the fact that the book does revolve around this poem and this poet. I'm extremely lucky to have a relationship with Fabio where I can write him and ask him questions, and we can talk about these things. And we talked about Isabel Freire's poem, but also her work, and he's a huge fan of her poetry, and feels like she hadn't received the attention she deserved. And he came across this poem, and it's a really central part of the novel, but it's also one of the catalysts for the novel. That it's something that he thought, here I am reading this, but it's also here it is. It's something that was in his mind, just as it's in Eduardo's, right? Or, the other, and his father, and, all of these characters where they've got this poem not only on the mind, but also, as we say in English, you learn it by heart. There it is. It's inside, and they're reciting it. And the translation of it evolved over the many drafts of the book, where I had an early draft that, was completely different. And then I kept changing it. And maybe you'll want to talk about this later on, but part of my process is to just kind of move through and not look back, especially in early drafts. So if something is changing, I'm not really thinking about it. So that was really kind of enlightening to me, to think of the different ways that I translated this poem, where and it also helped me arrive at a final draft of it, right? So and then Other Press, they're fantastic. They put the poem in bilingual in the back, as well as another one. So they're aware as well as of the poetics, of how significant it is for Fabio to have these poems in there, and to just be thinking of how, and I think that this comes out in the novel, where it's important to read poems out loud, right? So here we are, you've got this main character who is reading this poem out loud, and he can read the poem, recite the poem, and he changes. and when he's reading prose, he's you know, a total schmuck. He just can't get anything. You know, he's just like, he doesn't care what he's reading. And you know, when I write poems, I read them out loud. When Fabio writes them, he, you know, of course he's listening to the rhythms, listening to the cadence, to rhymes, and so on. So, you know, I feel like I'm kind of giving you a whole lot there to think about, but that's definitely, you know, things that were in my mind, and then thinking about that poem of always working on trying to tweak it and tighten it up, you know, across the drafts, across the book, in that poem in particular. But then the Italian poet, and I'm drawing a blank on his name, Rodari, is that where you know, it's recited to the deaf family, right, to those, right? That poem is incomplete in the Spanish. It's in the Spanish version of the book. There are fragments of it, and it's a little, you know, you can get the gist of it, but I talked to Fabio about putting the whole poem in there in the English version of this, so that you could see the rhyme scheme and you could think about the cadence there and the musicality that's coming out, so that you could understand why those kids are moving their feet and moving their bodies. In that poem, instead of the Spanish, I translated it from the Italian, right? So I went to the original and translated it that way.
Nice. Yeah, there is a lot there. I want to pick up on a few things for sure.
Sure.
And I can see Kathy's eyes too there. But yeah, I also totally appreciated that other press included the original poems and translation at the end, as well as the second poem by Freire. I translate Spanish as well, and so I never looked it up, but I was so glad to have it there and just be able to read it in the original, since I could.
Yeah, and she's not easy to find. She has been translated into English, but it was a long time ago. And you know, a little anecdote about all of this, you know, Fabio published this novel in Mexico, and it's available across the Americas, but he didn't really get in touch with the Freire family, you know, to get permission about it. And so when, you know, other press is really particular about copyrights and, you know, just going through and doing fact checking, you know, their editors are fantastic. So we ended up, you know, he ended up contacting, I don't know, I guess Isabel's nephew, maybe, and he gave permission. You know, he'd love to see the poems in this novel. And then I got in touch with him because I'm thinking, okay, well, you know, maybe we need a new translation of some of these Friday poems. Right. And you know, I've got so many different projects going. So if you're interested, you know, that may be something that you want to do as translators, or if you're just the only translator here, but to think about how, you know, fortunately this novel opened up a new poet to me. Right.
I was going to say, and I think to a lot of people, because I know even after, especially after seeing the poems at the end, I went and looked her up to try to find more of her poems, and they're not that readily available.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah. And just the poetry also in the novel to me is also in the prose, because it's very tight, it's very compact, it's very, you know, there's that subtle undertone to it of the irony and the humor. Did you read the whole translation out loud or only parts of it?
No, I read the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I've read, many times, right? So it's, I mean, I started translating poetry, so I kind of, I guess, created a habit that way of how I translate. I tend to write first drafts by hand, and then the second and third draft are the transcription into my computer. and so, you know, I wrote the novel by hand, right? And then,
Cool.
then another version, and another version in all, I think there were 8 or 9 drafts of this. So, you know, each time I read it in Spanish and I was reading my English and laughing and thinking, oh, I find this really exciting and tension grabbing, or, you know, attention grabbing, and, you know, creation of tension. I found it, you know, that it was repeated across the multiple readings. And I think that I mean, I felt really good about the translation in that sense, where I was finally getting it to as close to Fabio's Spanish as I could.
Mm-hmm. Amazing. Yeah. And this is not the first book that you've worked on with Fabio. You've worked with him before. So you already had that sort of, you know, relationship and working.
Yeah, I started translating. I met him in 2015. I was in Buenos Aires for sabbatical, and had kind of promised myself that I wasn't going to translate anything. I was just going to work on my own poems and essays. And I came across his book, El Idioma Materno, right, which I've translated as mother tongue, in a bookshop, you know, founded in, if you're familiar with Argentina, books are really expensive in Argentina. So I was always reluctant to buy books, but that was one that I thought, oh God, I have to have this. And I fell in love with it immediately. And my wife, you know, convinced me to write him and say, you know, can I translate you? I mean, here I am, I'm just writing him out of the blue. And he wrote back and said, who are you? What, you know, why, more or less, you know, what would you do with it? So I sent him a sample and kind of a kind of biography of work that I'd translated at that time, and thoughts on where I would try and publish it. And he said, that sounds great. Sure. I'm going to be in Buenos Aires for the book fair in a couple of months. Let's meet. And, you know, I had the great fortune of meeting him. And you know, he dedicated my book to my wife instead of to me, because he said, you know, because of you, you know, Curtis is translating me. And they, you know, they love each other. They're great. But the, you know, really the lucky thing that I have with Fabio is that I can be in touch with him. You know, I write him, and, you know, we correspond, and, you know, we've been kind of going back and forth recently about this new book of his that's out. He loves, I mean, that, I don't, if you're not familiar with mother tongue, it hasn't been published yet, the whole book, but a number of the pieces, you can find them if you just do a Google search, Fabio Morábito, Curtis Bauer translator, you'll find them kind of across the internet.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And I've got in other press, sorry to interrupt, but other press has a book of his short stories, you know, which I've finished. It's called Mothers and Dogs, which should be out next year, I think.
Excellent. Oh, that's great. Yeah, I look forward to reading more of his work for sure in your translation. Yeah. I just have to say, Curtis, I have almost the identical story for my very first book of translations. Was I found a book, read it, fell in love with it, felt I had to translate this. I had to find a way. And my partner said to me, write the author. What have you got to lose? Write the author. And that's what I did. So
Who is the author?
That was Edmundo Paz Soldan from Bolivia. Yeah. So
it's
so
it's so
that
great.
was
You have to take the leap, right? You have to jump in and
do. Exactly. And when a book impacts you that way, as these books do, you know, that's what better thing to spur you on to make it happen. Yeah. Fabulous.
Totally agree.
Good. Well, I'm going to open it up with Kathy and Heidi. Anything you've heard so far? Anything else? Let's let's keep it going here.
I was just curious, actually. This is kind of a question for both of you, since you both found the author and then the publisher. How did you find the publisher?
For me, it was a long process because, and it didn't actually even happen with the novel, right? I mean, I started sending work out, query letters out with mother tongue, and a number of people were interested in. One press actually said, we want to think about it a while longer, so if anything comes up, let us know first, and we'll give our decision. Mm-hmm. Fabio sent me Mothers and Dogs, the book of short stories, Madres y Perros, and then he also sent me the novel, El Lector a Domicilio, and said, why don't you work on these, in the meantime. And so I translated, I think, maybe the first 20 pages of the novel and a couple of the short stories from the book of short stories, and gave them to his agent. And then his agent got in touch with other press, and other press then, asked to see my samples, loved them. And I think other press is a fantastic press, and Judith Gerwich is, a great publisher. She had read Fabio in French translation, immediately fell in love with him. So she wanted to see the English samples, everything that I had, and said, okay, yeah, let's just go. And, the rest is history. Mm. What about you, Lisa? How did you?
Yeah, very similar. The book I fell in love with first was Amores Imperfectos, and it's flash fiction, which we published a couple of those in different journals, and then same thing, Edmundo's agent, when I wrote Edmundo, same thing, he was like, okay, well, let's talk about this. And I had just come back to Canada, and he was just over the border in New York State in Ithaca. So I was able to drive down and get to know him a little bit. And we decided to, try and collaborate together. And then it was his agent who was pitching his latest book, which was a novel. And again, I did a sample for that. I did go into competition. The agent found Houghton Mifflin as a publisher. They wanted another translator. Edmundo and Layla, hoped I would be the translator. I went into competition for that, and did get it. So
great.
So it's a lot of just beautiful synchronicities and a lot of support. Like, it took a whole team, really to make it happen, which I think is true a lot of the time for translation.
And I think also it sounds like you had a relationship, with Edmundo, and the same thing with Fabio, where he's putting my name out there as the translator, right? And saying, I want Curtis to translate this, and that helps a lot.
Yes. Yeah. And it makes a difference, when you have such a good working relationship, it makes a difference to the work. So.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I have to ask about one word.
Oh boy. No, not that question.
No, it's because I didn't know the word. And it's in the poem, it's in the main, but lowering.
Yeah.
And I was so curious because it stopped me in the tracks. And I'm primarily an interpreter, a Spanish English interpreter. I do some translating as well, which I love, but nothing to do with poetry, nothing. So I'm a ignoramus when it comes to how it works in that aspect. But that word, I'm just super curious, and I would love to hear your thinking process around it.
Well, as I had mentioned, and I'm going to admit to you that I don't have the English version with me. I've got the Spanish version. So I'm trying to find the poem here in the Spanish.
I can find it.
And but that was a word that I made the final decision in the final edits, right? There were multiple other possibilities, and I love the sound of that word. I love the sound of it, and it's one of those words that I just feel like it captures the mood in a particular tone of the poem, and a kind of oddity that's also there. And I thought, okay, I'm just gonna stick with this. And I remember not Judith, but my editor at Other Press saying, okay, this is okay, right? I mean, we're gonna stick with this. And I said, yeah, let's stick with this word.
I mean, Lisa, Heidi, I don't even know if you know,
I know some Spanish. I'm a translator too. I translate from German.
Okay.
But I do know a bit of Spanish. I taught English in Mexico for many years ago, and I learned a bit of Spanish while I was there. So I can kind of read it, but I wouldn't say I'm fluent.
This, just to put it in context, it's just the one line that I jotted down. It's tu piel que tiene brillos de mandolin turbia. Your skin with its lowering mandolin brilliance.
Mm-hmm.
That's line, and it comes up so often, but I just was like, whoop, whoop.
Yeah.
So is that the mind of a poet then that has access to vocabulary like that? Like somebody who regularly does the New York Times crossword puzzle and knows that they always use these particular little words?
I guess that's it. I mean, I have a process that, I always assume that every translator does the same thing, but that's not the case, obviously, because we all write differently. We all acquire languages differently. But when I translate, I give myself full freedom to just put every possible word there, right? So, and then in the next draft, I start to cross those possibilities off because, this one isn't going to work because it doesn't sound right. Maybe the meaning is close, but the sound is way off. Maybe it's a multi-syllabic word, and there's a certain rhythm to the sentence, and and the one English possibility is monosyllabic, and it's really stressed, it's really strong, and I don't want that. So even though that might be the closest in meaning or sense, that isn't necessarily it, right? I think that the sound and the sense are going to go together. And, thinking about that, tu piel como sábanas de arena y sábanas de agua en remolino, tu piel que tiene brillos de mandolina turbia, tu piel, right? So there's a certain rhythm that's being, right, that's created, and it felt right. Right. I mean, it's one of those really cloudy, nebulous responses, but it's like, oh, it felt good. It felt, yeah, it's right. It's the word.
I don't know. Heidi, Lisa, do you do poetry translation? Either of you?
No.
I've
tried.
A whole other animal.
Yeah.
I was asked by a songwriter once to translate some of his lyrics, and we ended up, my brother-in-law is also a songwriter. I ended up just kind of doing it and then giving it to him, and he kind of rewrote them because I just found it just not, I guess, just not something that I can do.
Yeah.
I think I was just got too hung up on what it was meaning, and not so much on the, all the other things that go along with the sounds and the rhythm and all that.
I mean, it's like being a sailmaker, and then being asked to make a wedding dress.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Right. I mean, you're working with fabric, right, and string, and that's about it. That's about how close they are. But I think, we've got poetry around us all the time, and when we think about the normal cadence of our everyday speech. I think that that's something that we need to listen to, or that I need to listen to. So I'm thinking, okay, well, how does this sound? Does it sound natural? Does it sound natural in Spanish? Or does it sound like capital P poetry in Spanish? You know, what are the different tonal qualities to, you know, to keep in mind? And then also thinking of how does that all fit with the context of the novel, right? This is a poem that has captivated this main character, and it captivated his father, and it captivated, you know, the maid, or the, you know, the helper, and one of the women that he reads to. I mean, and then, you know, all of the audience, you know, at the soiree, that, you know, so it's like everyone who hears the poem is taken in, and they're drawn into, you know, something about it. And I think that there's a certain mystery there. And then, you know, so getting back to that question about that word, maybe that's also something that entered into my decision of, you know, that's not a very common word. So there's some mystery to that, right?
Yeah. Well, that in itself is worth this whole visit for me.
Great. I
love hearing that and learning about knowing that.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, I was wondering too, just about this whole, you know, the book is, it's a social commentary about Mexico, about, you know, the city of Cuernavaca, this whole notion of people behind their walls, and a city that has more pools than it does soul. And, you know, that prose is so robotic, can be so robotic, but poetry can capture. But then poetry can also be sort of that upper echelon, theatrical, showy, you know, facade as well that happens in the book. And I was just curious if you knew how. I certainly know the book is incredibly well received in Mexico. It won a major literary prize. But I just wondered if you have any insight into, you know, how that part of it was received, you know, that commentary about the city, about the culture that this, you know, sort of.
That's a question I don't know, and that would have been great for Fabio to be here to answer. I mean, I can ask him and see, but just if you're familiar with his work, you'll realize that it's a new direction. You know, his work doesn't usually make that kind of social commentary. I mean, I'm not saying that his stories are light, because they're not. I mean, they touch on some really serious issues, but the issue of, let's say, narcos, of you know, of just the fact that you know, having to live with that kind of violence, and the normalization of that violence isn't something that is so common in his work. And for him to be speaking out in such a way, I think is significant. And, you know, and that, I think, it can be really, I would say that's something that would be interesting to readers in the US and Canada and other English-speaking countries, to be thinking of our understanding of, you know, what's it like to live in Mexico, right? I mean, we look at it from north of the border, let's say, and here you've got someone who's living there, having to deal with this on a day-to-day basis, and feeling, well, okay, how am I going to survive? What kind of uncertainty do I have to deal with all the time? And then just, you know, trying to get by and trying to be professional and legit and all of this, right? And yeah, and care for a father and mourn a father, that you don't really know. So all of these things I think are significant, but I think the social commentary is really important, has its weight there, and that's probably one of the reasons that it did so well in Mexico.
Yeah, and I don't think it's particular to Mexico either.
Right.
Certainly we can read that here, and I could certainly relate, the whole consumerism culture versus a culture that is vested in art and literature, or, certainly some things are different, but a lot of it was again, just a comment on humanity maybe at this point in its history, and how poetry does touch the heart, can touch it, and
changes, right? Because I mean, it changes everyone in the book. Really, everyone who is touched by that poem, I think, undergoes some kind of change, some kind of transformation.
Yeah. And it's expressed so subtly, like it is there, but it's not, we're not bashed over the head with that, which is again, the beauty of art.
Right. And when they try, when you are bashed over the head with it in the novel, it's like, oh my God, okay, this is what I hate about capital P poetry, let's say, the recitation of that poem, the drama, the dramatic reading, yeah. I mean, I love that. I laughed every time I got to that in my revision, just thinking of the commentary on those different readers or presenters at the final soiree, or not at the final one, but at the penultimate one.
At the one at the home.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah, that really was like watching it on television. It was so.
Yeah.
So Curtis, you do a lot of things. You teach, you write prose, poetry, you translate.
I do, yeah.
Do you need it? What pulls at you most? What are you always having to go, okay, I got to put that aside for a little bit because I have to get to this? I mean, or is it just the fabric of the whole of the combination?
That's a question that you've posed that question in a new way to me, which is, I appreciate, because usually people will ask, how do those two, poetry, my own writing and translation, coincide? Which way do I lean, right? And of all of the things, those two fit together. They're woven together. And it's something that I'm always working on, whether I'm writing my own work or I'm translating. I am a teacher. I teach at the university, and I try, what I've learned to do in my teaching is incorporate my own work, what I'm thinking about in my translations into my classes, so that when I teach a poetry workshop, I'm thinking about, okay, what am I reading? What are some questions that I've got about my own poems that I can talk about with that workshop, because I'm using it as well, kind of as my own workshop. And then in translation as well, where whether I'm translating a book of poems or I'm translating prose, maybe I'll focus that particular seminar or that whole semester long course, we're just going to focus on prose this semester because I'm translating a novel or I'm translating a book of short stories, and thinking about narrative and thinking about, okay, character development, even though characters are already developed, right? And I'm bringing them into English, I still have to think about how that works, right?
Yeah.
So getting back to your question, I sometimes get so caught up in my own work that I have to think, okay, I need to come back to the teaching, and I need to think of, what am I sharing with my students, and how is all of this a teaching moment, let's say. so that's something that I need to bring back. It's not that I need to push away. And I think that I'm always trying to get through a project. And something that I have some trouble with is maybe taking on too many projects. So I have to kind of put things aside where, like we said, you fall in love with a book, you read something new and say, oh, this hasn't been translated yet. But I've also come to realize I'm not the only translator in the world, right? I mean, I can tell my friends and say, hey, Isabel Freire needs to be translated into English. I just can't do that. And there she is for the world to see. And there are plenty of writers out there that I act as a kind of agent, I suppose, in a way for them and say, hey, I know these translators, let me put you in touch.
And why did you feel the need, going back to your first answer to the question, long answer to Lisa's first question, where you convinced Fabio to let you put the whole thing in the English, but he only had fragments in the Spanish. Why did it not have the?
I felt like there were some gaps. There were some gaps in the where I'm trying to remember the situation where he's reading the poem and then he's looking at the kids, right? And then he looks at the kids to see their reaction. And I didn't feel like the Spanish, what he had was enough to kind of generate that response from the kids. Okay. So I added a little bit more to it, like the really funny parts that I thought were missing, that would really capture the ear and the body movement of these kids. So I made sure that those were in there. And
sorry,
go ahead.
No, so you think that he did a poor job in that part of the book?
So this is the thing. Yeah, that's a great question.
That's why Fabio wanted to be here, Curtis.
Right,
I know,
exactly.
I know it.
I'm asking.
Yeah.
You think he could have done you think he could have done more in that part?
I'm not going to answer that question. What I'm going to say is that I feel like there was enough in the Spanish that to give the gesture of it.
That's right? What I was wondering. That's
right. There's enough. I mean, it's not that
it works in Spanish.
It works in Spanish.
Okay.
It works in Spanish, but and maybe it's because of the, how close it is. The Spanish and where the rhyme is a little bit more implicit in the poem, whereas in the English, my English translation of it, I felt like maybe it's more of my lack, right, where I needed more to support that scene. So I added more of the poem.
So English needed more to have the same effect as the Spanish.
My English translation.
More.
Not English in general, right? My English translation.
Your English, okay.
Yeah. You're really putting me on the hot seat here, which I totally appreciate.
That's so great.
I'm trying to find where that is in the Spanish version, and I'll kind of keep thinking about it here. If you've got another question.
I have a question for all three of you. So Eduardo, and I put this in my email to everyone in Wayfarers, but Eduardo is so detached, like we don't get his backstory, and we know he loves his father. And in fact, he loves his father a lot, because at one point he's almost, he says to his sister, well, wouldn't it be better if he were just dead, because of the pain he's going through with bone cancer. But he doesn't have friends, and he falls in love with Margot, but there's still this distance. And, probably the closest people from his sisters, quite close, but the other closest people are the waitresses in the Sanborns. And, there's this detachment, this distance, distance. And so I didn't really like Eduardo, but I didn't dislike Eduardo. I have this very ambivalent or conflicted relationship actually with Eduardo as the protagonist. And I just wonder what your experience of all three of you of Eduardo was.
I think that we know Eduardo basically from the point where he had his unfortunate accident. We don't know before, and it talks about how he lost friends, dropped off from then. And there seem to be parallels. He's digging into the past, wondering about his father's past. I don't know. We only know him from that point in his life forward, and he's lost a lot. I don't know. That's just an impression.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely.
I actually liked him. I did like him. I thought that he was very sympathetic. There were times when I wanted to shake him because, but I feel that way about my sister sometimes. It's not something that I don't like him, because there were times when I just thought you guess you shouldn't be doing this. I mean, you can. But I thought he was it didn't even really occur to me that there was no backstory to him. I didn't really even notice that.
Yeah.
I kept thinking we were going to hear details of the acts of whatever the crime he was accused of committing through that accident.
Yeah.
But we never get to
that. But
I expected that as well. By the time, I thought we're going to find out what that is by the time we get to the end of the novel. And I'm so happy that it didn't come, right? It just seemed to make total sense. And that these brothers, they know, in theory, they know what he did, and no one else does, right? I mean, I think Eduardo's a total asshole, but I really like him, right? And I just felt like maybe there's a little bit of Eduardo in all of us, and he's just allowing stuff to come out where he's saying, I don't understand a thing that I read. I'm just doing this because I have to. And that says something about his character. But then there's this thing with his father. He loves his sister, but he can't understand her relationship with Father Clark, and that Father Clark, I mean, who is that guy? He's
exactly
like this bizarre American, and then Margot, he falls in love with her, but he can't. There's this but she's older and she's in a wheelchair, and what's that? And then her maid, what happens there, and why is that? And then really these mother figures who are the waitresses at Sanborn's, right? It's like they care. He says at one point, I grew up with them. They saw me all the time with my father. And yeah, I mean, I feel like there's plenty there about him, plenty there not to like, but then, there's this transformation. Here's this guy who finds this poem and he thinks, is this a good poem? That whole part, what makes a good poem and what makes a bad one? And the fact that his father wrote it down, he's thinking, oh God, my father's a poet. But then he sees that it's someone else, and he feels, oh, he's relieved because his father isn't a poet. He just copied something down, right?
Yeah.
And then that sparks this other side. And he's this character that people care for, ultimately, right? I mean, his sister cared for him. She knew the whole time that her father, that his father, or no, she knew the whole time that they were paying these bribes, right? And he was trying to protect her.
Yes.
Right. And so he's totally oblivious, and that, I think that's most explicit when he doesn't know that he's reading to a deaf family, right? It takes him a while to figure out that this family is deaf. Yeah.
Yeah.
But then there's those questions you have, like two questions that have just come up. There's the bank employee Rosario, who he tries to wait out and is constantly sort of mentioning when he goes to the bank, and she somehow she just wants to keep her hands washed of him. That's a curious little side thing.
Yeah.
And then the deaf family, where they're not really all deaf, but they live deaf, and like the ventriloquist brothers, there's little oddities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Everywhere.
Which is totally Morábito, right? That's
Okay.
Fabio. I mean, that if you like, when you read his other stories and these pieces from mother tongue, that's what he loves, right? Just the odd occurrences in everyday life. That's a reality, but it's a reality that oftentimes isn't written about or isn't talked about or focused on, right? It's the huge drama that gets all the attention rather than the little ones. The fact that there are these two bachelor brothers who live together and they're just totally playing this guy, right? They're enjoying every minute of that. And that, the maid lies to him. What's that all about? Who's being manipulated there, right? Who's in the power situation, or what kind of power dynamic is that? And then I'm totally drawing a blank. I've got too many other things. The maid, or not, she's the nurse.
Celeste.
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 Celeste is just, she's this character who suddenly is in control of everything.
Yes.
Right.
It was, to me, it was so intriguing too that she was almost underwent a personality shift when she was outside the home compared to when she was in the home.
The whole thing with the oil, right? Where like the lotion that, like, she just turns it, like she starts giving everyone a massage. Oh my God. I mean, it just cracked me up, all this stuff going on and trying to keep it straight. And Celeste is just like this, you think, she's illiterate, doesn't have any power at all, and ultimately she's the one who makes decisions.
Right?
Somebody who in most circumstances would go unseen, and suddenly look what we see.
Pretty
cool.
She's the savior of these old men, of Eduardo's father, and the colonel, then the colonel, right?
And Eduardo.
And Eduardo. Yes. And ultimately, Eduardo, he is a hero. He is the hero of the story, not just because he's the protagonist, but it is incredibly selfless what he does for the deaf children, to make the parents understand that the kids aren't deaf and can go to school and can live, a hearing life while still interacting with the deaf family. And in the bookstore, the tragic end where he is physically, literally the hero who, saves the front row from disaster. He's this unsuspecting hero,
Right.
The juxtaposition to the man who did something so spontaneously, just sort of inappropriate, with the little girl under the table.
Yes.
Not terrible, but not appropriate.
And those scenes, you think, how is this going to be received in the US, right? But also, how is it received in Mexico? It says a lot about the character, that he doesn't understand that it's inappropriate. Right. That says a lot about Eduardo. And even what's going through his mind when, he's in Margot's house, she's not there, he's drinking tequila with the maid, and he sees her naked, and he's thinking, do I have sex with her? Do I not? And then, his head, he just all of this stuff, right? totally inappropriate.
Yeah.
And
Right.
yeah, but then you think he gets out of it somehow, and you think, well, that's why he had this accident. I mean, he did something that was probably totally inappropriate, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I think also that's ultimately why we don't really care that much at the end, specifically what it is, because we've seen all these other little things going along throughout the book. And so we get a picture of him, and it ultimately, it doesn't really matter what it was that he
Right.
did.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although I have to say that Denise couldn't be here today, and she said, please, could you ask what that accident was about? She was so curious, and she felt so unsatisfied that she didn't really get, what it was. And
But we don't get lots of background. We
it's
don't know what
so
happened to
true.
Margot. I don't think we don't get to know what happened to Margot.
Not really, do we?
I don't think so. She had an accident, right? And
There's
there's
kind of a curtain to the past.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. And like Celeste, how does she, because she has a child she never sees, right? She's from a village that's outside of Cuernavaca. The sister, she was married and now she's not. Father Clark, is there somehow, and the shenanigans he does.
Yes.
Who knows what
Exactly.
that's about.
Yeah.
Well, poor Denise. She's not going to get any more insight.
I know. She knew she wasn't going to get an answer, but she was excited
and
to try.
Fabio, had he been here, wouldn't have given anything.
Exactly. Yeah, she was just commenting that she's so curious what that was. But yeah. I'm going to ask one last question, Curtis, and then we're going to let you go. And it's you shared an interview you did with Asymptote, the wonderful journal, and you were talking about poetry, and in the end you said we must have a reaction to a poem or it's just scribbles on a page. I think the same is true for novels. I think that if we're not reading kind of like Eduardo with some attention and taking something in, then we're just kind of like eating without chewing or swallowing. We're just, regurgitating. And so this question is for everyone again here. But so if you had to sum it up, what was your reaction to this novel? What did you swallow and take in from this novel?
It's a great question. Personally, I think it has to do with that, what I've been talking about, since the first question, thinking about what the importance of poetry and how it has this transformative nature to it, and maybe what that is, not just poetry, but really attention to what you're saying, attention to beauty of language, attention to giving breath to what you're what is there. And I feel like once he started to think about what he was saying, he changed. Right. And once we start to think, if only more people thought about what it is the hell they're saying, there would be so much change in our world. I don't want to go to this dark place, but I'm thinking a lot about what happened in Texas last week, and what happened, in Houston at the NRA convention, and the fact that I watched a snippet of Trump's speech, and just that language, how empty the language is, but how there's such power behind that is so dangerous, right? It's like, it just, I don't know. I get really frustrated, obviously, and disturbed by it. But I feel like that might be something that's inside this novel, right? To think of, we can't just live kind of reading what's on the page, right? There has to be some sense, some feeling, some real emotion in it, and that's going to come out.
Yeah, beautiful. Thanks.
You know, I was really struck by the juxtaposition of this very serious aspects of the book, the violence, the, you know, the protection money that he had to pay and all that kind of stuff. And yet there was also a lot of kind of tongue-in-cheek humor to it. And I think sometimes when you are reading something that is really touches on very serious aspects of life that many of us face or potentially face, and then if it's when you have these little bits of humor, it kind of it doesn't trivialize it. It just makes it, I think, a little bit easier to absorb. And that really struck me about this novel.
Yeah. True.
Yeah. Kathy?
Oh, I was going to, I know that we've taken Curtis's hour.
No,
It's
you're
okay.
fine. You're fine.
Okay.
I'd love to hear
Two-
what you
Two
what you
more
think about it.
seconds.
Yeah.
I loved how he told how Fabio was able to present in a great big giant IMAX screen of sort of all of Mexico or Cuernavaca society with just these few people and those little oddball bits and pieces. I just loved the huge image that these little pieces created.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Like a kind of snapshot of these different members of society that created. Yeah.
You know, like the pictures I know there's a description for these. Is it million tiny little photographs, but then you look and then it's an image?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's a
There's
little detail. It's sometimes it's those little details that really stick in your mind.
Yeah. He was talking about, at one point, it's toward the end, you know, thinking about all of the walls in this city,
Yes.
and and how they're crumbling. Some of them are crumbling, what that signifies, right? The kind of symbolic meaning of, well, there are people on each side of those walls, and the fact that they're crumbling, there aren't people there to care for them. And, you know, so all of this deterioration, I think, is, you know, again, pretty symbolic. You know, yeah, I mean, that kind of takes me in a lot of different directions of, you know, the stuff that goes on in there. Yeah. What about you, Lisa?
Yeah, I think it's similar to a lot of what's been said, but what I take from this is that there's always more. There's always more we can understand to a situation. You know, even just as we were talking here tonight or today, I was thinking about, I hadn't thought that, you know, how Eduardo's actions as portrayed in these odd little situations with the girl under the table, the inappropriateness with Margot's maid, tells us something about his accident. You know, there's always more, and there's more to characters, and there's more to each of us, and we get these little snippets, like you say, Kathy, that forms a picture, but what's behind it all, and that, you know, that comes from taking time and thinking about it and spending, you know, a bit of time with the book, with your own thoughts, and not just just robotically reading it, even with a beautiful voice like Eduardo's, you know. There's more, so much more. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Curtis. This has been really wonderful.
It's been my pleasure. It's great to meet you all. Thank you for reading.